All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Albertson. I am the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thanks, as always, for taking the time to join us. It's a busy morning. There's a lot of cars coming through the gate, so I know there's a lot of activities going on. But this is a big pleasure for me to welcome James Stokes, who's the Director of Nuclear Policy, Defense Policy, and in the Defense Policy and Planning Division at NATO HQ, for his talk titled NATO Nuclear Adaptation. And over the last several years, we've had lectures by the previous person in this position, Jessica Cox, and there was always high demand for those, and we've gotten high demand to bring in Jessica's successor, Jim. So sort of you asked, we listened, and Jim is more than happy to do this and taking time out of his evening to do it, so we're excited to have him here. So I did the NATO nuclear deterrence portfolio 5 years ago, 2019, sort of a different time in the world, a different speed at NATO, a different level of trying to push allies to do more. The US has always been trying to sort of push allies to do more, but there's been a dramatic sort of change post-Ukraine. There's a lot more going on. And Jim can describe some of these efforts and describe sort of nuclear in the broader piece of NATO's deterrence, and then sort of things that they're working on, things that they're pushing. So this is going to be a really good talk, and I think really timely and relevant. So let me say a little bit about Jim. He like I said, he's the Director of Nuclear Policy. What his position is responsible for is developing and implementing NATO nuclear policy, organizing exercises, doing policy symposiums, training programs, and then providing policy support to the Secretary General on nuclear deterrence. He chairs the nuclear planning group. So this is the big group at NATO that Secretary of Defense goes to when they have one in conjunction with a summit. As part of that, he does what's called the NATO Planning Group Staff Group, which is sort of runs everything up the chain to support that effort. Prior to NATO, he was a nuclear capabilities advisor within the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Matters. He was detailed to the U.S. mission to NATO in Brussels as an attaché. He provided policy and acquisition advice related to the modernization of NATO's nuclear deterrent capabilities, including weapons, dual-capable aircraft, infrastructure, and NC3. He was also the representative of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs, who is the NATO high-level group's vice chair for safety, security, and survivability. So in his talk, he'll talk a little about the high-level group. He'll talk a little about the nuclear planning group. You'll get to know sort of these different bodies. Very excited to have him here. Sort of the ground rules for those unfamiliar with CGSR lectures. Jim has some slides. He's going to go through those for maybe 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor for discussion. So at any point in the conversation, get your hand up, start typing your questions in the chat. That makes it easy for me to sort of start the conversation organically when he concludes his remarks, and we'll get right into it. So Jim, thanks very much. Over to you.
No, Mike, thanks for having me on today. I wish I could be there out in Livermore. I have fond memories of lots of trips out there to Livermore, as well as a lot of the other labs across the NNSA complex from my previous position when I worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. But I'm glad I'm able to join you remotely from Brussels here this evening. As you said, so I'm the Director of Nuclear Policy here, and my team and I provide policy advice to the Secretary General and also to allied leaders about all aspects of NATO nuclear deterrence. And then I chair NATO's principal subordinate committee underneath the Nuclear Planning Group. So we call that the Nuclear Planning Group Staff Group. And then we provide support to other NATO nuclear bodies like the High Level Group, which is a senior advisory body chaired by the United States. And then also for the Nuclear Planning Group, which is NATO's principal forum where we make all decisions concerning any aspects of NATO nuclear deterrence, to include our nuclear forces here. And that nuclear planning group typically meets at the level of defense ministers. So it's kind of the scope of work of what we're working with here. So just to note that, earlier this year, we celebrated NATO's 75th anniversary with a great summit that was held back in Washington in July. And one thing that stands out from NATO's history is that no state has launched an armed attack against the alliance. And in my view, I think one of the principal reasons for that is the fact that since its inception in 1949, NATO has been a nuclear alliance and will continue to be one. So the alliance has managed to convince an adversary either that aggression would fail or that the costs we could impose would outweigh any expected gains. And in other words, NATO's deterrence has worked. And at recent summits, allies have taken historic decisions to strengthen our deterrence and defense against the resurgence of an aggressive Russia. So NATO has been revitalizing its defense plans, the first major revision since the end of the Cold War. It's working hard to implement them through investment in capabilities and force structure, exercises, command and control, how we improve interoperability across our forces. And in this security environment, we really must be able to maintain deterrence, to manage escalation, and if necessary, to fight and win conflict if deterrence fails. So today I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing, provide an overview of NATO's nuclear deterrence, and then conclude by note on some of the things that we're working on currently here within the alliance. Next slide, please. Back one. There we go, the context. So first, let's talk with a little bit of strategic context as a scene setter. So the transatlantic security environment has rapidly deteriorated, chiefly due to Russia's brutal war against Ukraine. So if the last time we sort of checked in with what NATO is doing in nuclear deterrence, things have certainly changed in the last couple of years. From my perspective, when I arrived here at NATO headquarters, it was in February of 2022. It was the week that Russia launched its full-scale invasion against Ukraine. And that's when I arrived here to start working on NATO nuclear deterrence issues, first representing the US government, and then over the past year as an employee of the NATO international staff, so working on the NATO side of this. And I don't know that I can necessarily compare to what it was like here in the past, but I can say over the last 2.5 years that I've been working here at NATO headquarters, there's a lot of focus on deterrence and defense writ large, how we're preparing the alliance for any type of crisis or conflict situation, and certainly what we need to do from a nuclear perspective. And it's not just the conventional conflict that Russia's been waging against Ukraine that's really sort of changed our threat perception. We have also seen that Russia's used nuclear threats and attempts at coercion to deter Western intervention in Ukraine. Russia's employed dual-capable missiles against Ukraine, which increases the risk of escalation. And I think we all understand that Russia's long considered nuclear deterrence as an integral part of its political military strategy, but it's also exploring how it can use nuclear threats for intimidation or coercion. And China is also expanding and modernizing its nuclear forces, on track to triple its inventory of nuclear warheads within the next 15 years, and doing this in an opaque manner without any apparent interest in nuclear arms control. Russia and China have a very close strategic relationship, and we're also seeing how Iran and North Korea are also providing material support to Russia's war against Ukraine. And Iran is much closer to developing a nuclear weapons capability. North Korea continues to modernize their own capabilities, and both of them have long-range ballistic missiles that can threaten NATO allies and partners in different regions around the world. So what we're faced with is a multipolar nuclear world with adversaries who are cooperating to undermine the rules-based international order. We've also seen an erosion of the arms control, disarmament, and nonproliferation architecture, with Russia withdrawing from different treaties. China, again, has no interest in arms control, and many nations in the global south are calling for a ban on nuclear weapons. And we've also seen a number of nations that are very critical of NATO's nuclear policies and posture. And then lastly, deterrence is increasingly complex with entanglement risk from emerging and disruptive technologies. There are risks of inadvertent escalation. And then we have multiple interconnected domains that we need to operate in, to include space and the cyber domain. So it's increasingly a very challenging environment that we find ourselves in, and we have to think through those different complexities. Next slide, please. To focus specifically about the threat coming from Russia now, Russia began modernizing and diversifying its nuclear capabilities approximately 2 decades ago, including the triad of its strategic nuclear capabilities. According to unclassified sources, Russia has over 4,000 nuclear warheads. I think what's of chief concern to us here at NATO are approximately 1,600 non-strategic nuclear warheads and how those could be employed against the alliance. Russia also has dual capable short and intermediate range missiles that can deliver nuclear or conventional warheads from air, ground, or sea-based platforms, and is developing a number of novel nuclear-capable systems, such as hypersonic missiles, that could also be very challenging for our defensive capabilities. We're also watching to see if Russia will actually station its nuclear weapons in Belarus, which is a factor we take pretty seriously here. And in addition to Russia's nuclear capabilities, we're also watching its doctrine, rhetoric, and its behavior. So I'm sure a number of you have watched as President Putin recently announced that there could be a forthcoming change to Russia's nuclear doctrine. We noted some of those potential changes. Of course, we're waiting to see when the doctrine is going to be published, and we can examine it more closely. But noting that there was an inclusion of Belarus specifically in that announcement, seeming to change some of the conditions under which Russia may consider employing its nuclear weapons, if there's a critical threat to Russian sovereignty, if there's a non-nuclear state that could be supported by a nuclear state, and whether that could be considered a joint attack, and hence Russia could hold a third-party state responsible, and also the types of conventional attacks that Russia would consider potentially justifying a nuclear response, to include mass air power strikes, drone strikes, and things of that nature. So from my perspective, I think Russia's trying to increase the utility of its nuclear deterrent to encompass more ways that Russia might be threatened, and hence to try to intimidate NATO and deter aggression. But NATO is a defensive alliance, and of course, we're not going to act aggressively toward Russia. I would also say that I don't think that we're intimidated, nor are we going to be coerced by some of these changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine. But we do need to consider the different perceptions of threat on each side, what actions or messages are considered destabilizing, and do we really understand each other's threat perception? And I think that's at the heart of potential escalation dynamics between NATO and Russia if we ever got into a direct crisis or conflict. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about our deterrence framework. So here at NATO, we focus on three components for what we call our deterrence framework. So we look at how we can have militarily effective capabilities. We need to have the resolve or the political will to employ those capabilities if needed, and an effective way to communicate our capabilities and resolve. And if we're able to put those components together, we think that we would have successful deterrence, which inherently is about affecting the decision-making or the calculus of an adversary to convince it from taking an action that we don't want it to take. And of course, it's all very much dependent on those perceptions by a potential adversary, whether or not deterrence will be successful. I always say that that's a little bit of a convoluted way of explaining deterrence, and I think very simplistically for us, we're looking at how we can deter a nuclear attack by Russia against the alliance, or something else that may be considered very threatening to the allies, to our populations and territory. And how we're going to sort of explore this in the next few slides, I'm going to talk more about our military capabilities, and then I'll go into resolve and then effective communications. So next slide, please. So first, as I mentioned, we have to have militarily effective capabilities. Within NATO, we've got three allied nuclear powers with the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. And here you can see some of their nuclear forces, many of which are considered strategic nuclear forces. We often say that the strategic nuclear forces of the alliance, and particularly those of the United States, are the supreme guarantee of the security of the alliance. Of course, the United Kingdom has dedicated its nuclear deterrent to the defense of the alliance since 1962. France maintains an independent nuclear deterrent, which does contribute to the overall security of the alliance. But what I'd like to highlight there in blue are what we would consider our theater nuclear forces. So these consist of allied dual capable aircraft units, which are also complemented by U.S. forward deployed nuclear weapons and U.S. forces that maintain custody of those weapons. And these are generally what we refer to when we say NATO nuclear forces. Next slide, please. So for decades, allies have made commitments and contributions to NATO's nuclear mission. And these have been an intrinsic part of NATO's deterrence and defense posture in Europe, basically since the early 1950s. So when we talk about sharing the nuclear burden, and what that really means is demonstrating how the alliance's capabilities, as well as the solidarity, the unity, the resolve we have, how that really comes together through shared political decision-making about all aspects of NATO's nuclear deterrence, as well as how we would share the operational risk in a NATO nuclear mission if we ever have to conduct one. So early this year, the allies in the Nuclear Planning Group agreed to some new categories of what we call nuclear burden sharing. And these really consist of three different things. First, you have the strategic nuclear forces of the United States and the United Kingdom, which are managed by those two nuclear powers. Again, France has its own nuclear forces, but those are kept separate from the NATO nuclear mission. But of course, we rely on those two nuclear powers and the nuclear capabilities they provide to the alliance. The second category is what we would term our nuclear sharing arrangements. So these are really bilateral agreements between the United States and certain allies to either host U.S. nuclear weapons or provide different types of dual capable aircraft. And lastly, the largest category, if you will, is what we call broader participation in NATO's nuclear mission. So this includes conventional capabilities that can be used to support nuclear operations, how allies share intelligence so we have a good threat picture, participation in NATO nuclear exercises, hosting of different nuclear-related events, a lot of different ways that the allies can actually contribute to what we need for NATO's nuclear deterrence. The core of the mission really does focus on how we can utilize dual capable aircraft, or what we call DCA. These are aircraft that are flown by allied pilots who are trained and certified to employ U.S. nuclear weapons. So our nuclear sharing arrangements have been around since the 1950s, since about the time when the U.S. began forward deploying its nuclear weapons to Europe in 1954. And, again, we're signed through a number of bilateral agreements with different allies. Our nuclear sharing arrangements do predate the NPT treaty. They were in fact discussed at length amongst the allies, also with the Soviet Union and with other nations during the drafting and the negotiations of the NPT. And it's only in recent years that we've seen that Russia and now also China and a few other nations have attempted to delegitimize NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. From my perspective, I think what they're trying to do is to undermine the unity we have on nuclear issues because it serves their political purposes. And one last thing to note here on the slide, since we are talking about capabilities, are the pictures of some of the aircraft that we have. So on the left-hand side, you'll see some of the legacy dual capable aircraft we have with F-16s, F-15s, and Tornadoes. And a number of allies are making this transition to the F-35A as our future DCA platform. And in fact, the Netherlands completed that transition earlier this year, so they have completely transitioned over to the F-35 as their DCA platform. The United States is in the process of making that transition now, and other allies will follow in future years. And the U.S. is also modernizing its nuclear weapons in Europe with the transition to the B-61-12. All of these modernizations, as well as the massive investment by our three nuclear powers and their strategic nuclear forces, overall are strengthening our nuclear deterrent and will sustain the mission into the foreseeable future. Next slide. But for the DCA mission, it really can't be effective unless we have conventional support to nuclear operations, or CISNO as we call it. So here you can see kind of a notional depiction of the air power capabilities that would be needed to support a NATO nuclear mission. So this includes ISR aircraft, air-to-air refueling, we need AWACS, and we need a number of fighter aircraft and ideally fifth-generation fighters for suppression of enemy air defenses and also for fighter escort. So currently, NATO nuclear mission is primarily supported by air capabilities, but we are considering how we can employ different types of joint capabilities from across the military services that are provided by the allies. And one thing to note here is when allies are investing in different types of conventional capabilities, ideally, because we're focused on how we can support our collective defense, providing a pool of capabilities to secure and shape so that if we ever need to, provide for our own defense, we've got those capabilities. But as we're growing that pool of capabilities, that can also support a NATO nuclear mission. So it's a way that our investments in conventional defense are also strengthening nuclear deterrence. And it also gives a number of ways for allies to broaden participation in NATO's nuclear mission by providing different types of conventional capabilities. Next slide, please. So moving on to the second part of the deterrence framework, this is resolve, or the political will to act. There's different ways that we demonstrate resolve within the alliance. We've got policy statements, such as our 2022 strategic concept, political statements, such as our summit communiques, broad participation in NATO's nuclear consultations and our exercises, and also in our operational mission. Allies within the nuclear planning group do share the political responsibility for decision-making over NATO's nuclear forces and also the operational risk for a mission. We think that this sends a strong signal to an adversary about NATO's unity, and it's also one of the reasons why nuclear burden sharing is increasingly important in the current security environment. And then lastly, we do have our exercises, or different demonstrations of capability, which are used to prepare our military forces, but also can have a deterrence effect as well. Next slide, please. So earlier this spring, the Allies approved an update to NATO's core nuclear policy document. So this was approved by the defense ministers and the nuclear planning group. This new policy document does incorporate many of our public statements that we've made about nuclear deterrence, such as some of those that are listed here. And it also reflects the current security environment that we're in now. And just to reiterate a few of these things that we do say often, but it's worth saying, the fundamental purpose of NATO nuclear forces is to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. And we do see that nuclear weapons are unique, and that any employment of nuclear weapons against NATO would fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict. And of course, if the security of any of our members are threatened, we have the capabilities and the resolve to impose costs on an adversary that would be unacceptable and far outweigh any benefits that they would hope to achieve. And of course, that as long as nuclear weapons exist, that NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. And some of these points have been said for many years now, and they are definitely very germane to the environment that we're in now. Let's go on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about some of our internal processes here. So within NATO, the Nuclear Planning Group is responsible for all decisions concerning NATO's nuclear deterrence policies, our plans, our posture. Typically, it meets at the level of defense ministers, but it could also be the permanent representatives or our ambassadors from the different allies. Allies maintain full political control over all aspects of NATO nuclear decision-making. So this means that no decisions are actually delegated down to SACEUR, the military authorities, in peacetime, crisis, or conflict. So the NPG must authorize all nuclear-related actions, and those are consensus decisions. The NPG was established in 1966, and it's turned into the primary forum where we discuss all nuclear issues within NATO, and all allies are members of the NPG with the exception of France. So within NATO, we in effect have separate decision-making centers. We've got our 3 allied nuclear powers with the US, UK, and France. And to a different extent, we have another decision-making center within the Nuclear Planning Group. And we think that these separate centers of decision-making enhance deterrence because it complicates the calculations of an adversary. So they have to consider what each individual nuclear power might do, as well as what NATO might do collectively. And that sort of ambiguity, we think, maintains a high threshold for nuclear use against the alliance. Next slide, please. And then lastly, that third component of our deterrence framework is on communications. They need to be effective, and we really need to consider how we're communicating to a variety of different audiences. So of course, from a deterrence perspective, we need to be able to communicate our resolve. We need to demonstrate our capabilities, to an adversary so that we can either maintain or reinforce deterrence. But there's another aspect of communications that I think is really important in today's environment. And that supports the other side of my mission, if you will, which is assurance or reassurance. So how do we reassure over 1 billion people in allied nations that we're now protecting, that we're taking prudent measures to deter aggression? And I think part of this is also about transparency, about sharing information about some of our nuclear activities, such as our annual nuclear exercise, Steadfast Noon, which just wrapped up last month. And we do this so that we can avoid some miscalculation by adversaries, but also so that we avoid some of the misunderstanding by our publics. And obviously, given the current environment we're in, there's a lot more interest in all sort of nuclear related issues, both what Russia's doing, but also what we are doing and what the different allied nuclear powers are doing. And we think that proactive communications helps us get the facts out first. It does help us to reduce some miscalculation, and it helps us to shape the narrative. We're also using different tools such as polling. We have information environment assessments. This helps us get some feedback on different public attitudes or how our messages are resonating within the media, and it helps us to improve strategic communications. Next slide, please. And for my final slide, let's talk a little bit about where we're going. Obviously, a lot of the work that we do here at NATO is classified, so we can't get into a lot of details. But in the current security environment, of course, it's vital that we, make sure that NATO's nuclear deterrence remains effective and credible. We've been taking steps for a number of years now, even preceding the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But continuing on that path and in fact trying to increase some of the work that we're doing. The summit declaration from the Washington summit earlier this year had a number of statements in there related to some of the nuclear work we're doing, but to point out that allied heads of state and government said NATO remains committed to taking all necessary steps to include modernizing its nuclear capabilities, strengthening its nuclear planning capability, and also adapting as necessary. So the big question is, what are these steps? What exactly are we doing now? Well, first, we're reinvesting in our collective understanding of Russia, its nuclear strategy, its doctrine, and its forces, and how it might behave. And I think we're also reinvesting in understanding the logic of our own nuclear strategy so that we can think and plan and act coherently in a potential crisis or a conflict situation. A part of this is about SHAPE and its nuclear planning capability, but I think it's also about ensuring allies have a clear understanding of our plans and strategy at a political level so we can facilitate nuclear consultations and decision-making, both here in Brussels at NATO headquarters and also in allied capitals, so that we can improve the preparedness of the alliance. I think we're also learning about escalation dynamics, both from observing Russia's war against Ukraine, but also from Russia's nuclear rhetoric and signaling. So a lot of the behavior that it's engaging in now, and trying to see how that might translate into a potential conflict between NATO and Russia at some point in time. We're using exercises and war games to explore a lot of these dynamics and ensure we have effective crisis decision-making, which is underpinned by SHAPE's military planning. And then again, thinking about how do we carefully craft our deterrence messaging so that we can communicate clearly and unambiguously to an adversary, also signal our resolve and to defend allied territory, populations, and forces. And as I mentioned earlier, allies are following through on longstanding commitments to modernize their nuclear forces, and we're in the process of modernizing our NC3 capabilities. And I think it was critically important. We have to continue to look at how we could have greater coherence across all domains, all instruments of power, and specifically between our conventional and nuclear forces. And then lastly, we are deepening our understanding of some of the future challenges that are out there, such as the challenges posed by China and other actors, and then also looking at some of the implications of emerging and disruptive technologies, where those may offer potential benefits, but also some potential risks that we need to consider in the context of NATO nuclear deterrence. With that, I think I'll pause there and perhaps we can turn into questions and answers. I really appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk with you all today, and thanks again for the invitation.